Picture yourself positioned next to a person whom the entire community insists deserves your complete confidence. The marriage feast has concluded, the sound of shared amusement echoes through the air, and the teams of horses rest outside. Illumination from lanterns flows over the grounds. Faces light up with joy as eyes turn toward you, while voices carry assurances of your good fortune, your divine favor, and the immense honor your kinfolk must experience. Nevertheless, deep under the fabric of the clean white prayer covering fastened meticulously upon your head, an unsettling sensation takes root. It is not a matter of typical anxiety or simple hesitation. It is a profound sense of error. For months, you labored to persuade yourself that this inner alarm would eventually fade away, dismissing it as mere trepidation, natural wedding jitters, or an inadequacy in your own spiritual devotion. Yet the evening of your nuptials has arrived, leaving no remaining sanctuary where you can evade reality. In that moment, he utters a solitary remark, a brief phrasing of mere words, and a sudden clarity hits you. The person to whom you just bound your life is entirely different from the individual the community perceives, and completely foreign to the person you thought you knew. That very evening marked the moment of my escape. I spent my formative years embedded deeply within the Old Order Amish lifestyle, raised in an exceptionally traditional settlement located in Pennsylvania. My upbringing took place within a household anchored thoroughly by a reverence for ecclesiastical governance, familial obligations, and absolute submission to the Creator. In our local district, my mother and father held a position of high esteem. Though riches eluded us, our household possessed a reputation for steadfastness and unwavering adherence to our collective guidelines. Close to 24 years of my existence transpired wholly within those boundaries, defined by learning in a parochial schoolhouse, journeying exclusively by horse and carriage, and donning traditional plain attire. I undertook the spiritual preparations for holy baptism and formal integration into the congregation precisely according to the established path laid out for me. Throughout the vast majority of those years, I maintained a firm conviction that I genuinely comprehended the community surrounding me, just as I assumed I truly comprehended the individual I had chosen as a partner. That assumption was entirely mistaken, as the events of that post-wedding evening brought to light a well-concealed deception that had endured for a generation, revealing a reality that, once uncovered, could never be obscured again. In order to comprehend the motivations behind my flight, it is essential to first grasp the mechanics of matrimony within numerous Amish congregations. A union of this nature transcends a mere private bond between a man and a woman, operating instead as a collective community endeavor. Kinships observe closely, the ministry monitors the progression, and immense weight is placed upon a person's standing, their moral fiber, and their adherence to submissive cooperation. Generally, the youth initiate courtship only after undergoing the ritual of baptism, and while their interactions remain highly confidential compared to mainstream societal standards, the identity of the pairing inevitably becomes common knowledge. The bond is strictly regarded as an unbreakable, lifelong covenant, a standard that is explicitly communicated and constantly reinforced. Although the local ordnung may not dictate every single nuance of the courtship process, the overarching expectations of the congregation heavily influence virtually every choice made along the way. I embraced this framework without resistance, a path shared by the majority of my peers. When the marriage day finally arrives, a universal presupposition exists that the bride and groom share a profound mutual understanding, or at least, that is the prevailing sentiment. In retrospect, I recognize that a great number of us mistakenly equate mere day-to-day familiarity with genuine, deep comprehension. I was well aware of his physical presence, his work ethic, and the favorable opinions whispered by neighbors, yet the actual essence of his internal character remained completely hidden from me, and that critical distinction redirected my entire destiny. Our initial introduction occurred during my 19th year, when he presented himself as a reserved, courteous, and dependable young man who frequently garnered the approval of the senior congregation members. His lineage was highly regarded, given that his father had occupied a position in the ministry and his mother possessed a reputation for extending charity to neighbors in moments of crisis. Every visible attribute suggested he was a man of integrity, and as our courtship commenced, our interactions maintained a guarded and formal quality. Such restraint was entirely typical, meaning that neither of us gave voice to our internal anxieties or uncertainties. It is rare for couples within our culture to spend extended periods analyzing the intricacies of their inner lives prior to marriage, as there is a widespread belief that a unified foundation of faith supersedes all else. I operated under that very same conviction, and for a span of almost 3 years, our association progressed precisely along the conventional trajectory, marked by bi-weekly worship services, kinship gatherings, Sunday night youth functions, and communal events. No anomalies caught my attention, and if indicators of trouble existed, they completely escaped my notice. Occasionally, he would vanish for extended intervals without prior warning, though an excuse was always readily provided, whether it involved rendering assistance to a neighbor, a job obligation, or completing necessary tasks elsewhere. Because these justifications appeared plausible, I never cross-examined him, as harboring skepticism felt like a betrayal of the values instilled in me from childhood. Our formal betrothal took place as the autumn drew to a close during my 23rd year, with the marriage ceremony set for the subsequent November. The announcement brought joy to everyone around us. My mother shed soft tears upon hearing the news, my father offered a firm handshake of acceptance, and the presiding bishop extended his blessings. I recall a sensation of profound relief overtaking me, far outweighing any sense of joyous anticipation, an emotion I misread at the time as a sign of personal growth and emotional maturity. Looking back from the present, I discern that it was a manifestation of an internal voice attempting to sound an alarm, an intuition I simply lacked the capacity to interpret. The interval leading up to the ceremony dissolved into a frantic haze of garment making, culinary preparation, kinship visitations, and logistical arrangements. Whenever acquaintances inquired about my anticipation, my response was always a manufactured smile and an affirmative word. Internally, however, a nameless sensation persisted, an unrelenting weight, an unspoken caution that intensified dramatically as the date drew nearer. Despite this, I continued along the prescribed path, fully aware that halting the process would necessitate demanding explanations, and initiating such inquiries poses a profound challenge within a society anchored entirely by absolute certainties. The chosen morning dawned frigid and unclouded, prompting me to rise well ahead of the sun with a knotted stomach that made nourishment nearly impossible to swallow. Before the first light broke, the dwelling swelled with female relatives, their conversations echoing through the hallways amidst the soft friction of traditional fabric and the constant movement of doors. A sense of purposeful direction and absolute assurance seemed to envelop every person present, leaving me under the impression that I alone harbored silent trepidation. By the time afternoon arrived, the formal proceedings had drawn to a close, following exhaustive periods of theological exhortations, prolonged standing, and sustained pleasantries. The hours seemed to stretch out indefinitely, yet paradoxically evaporated in a flash. With the arrival of dusk, the attendees gradually made their departure, causing the lively sounds and collective energy to diminish, until, at long last, my new husband and I found ourselves entirely solitary. It was at this precise juncture that the veil of deception began to fray, initiated by an overheard exchange that was never intended for my ears. An unprecedented stillness eventually settled over the residence, marking the first occasion all day devoid of well-wishing neighbors, kinfolk, or fellow believers, leaving only the two of us in the silence. I recall positioning myself beside the kitchen table, clearing away the remnant dishware from the evening meal, while enduring a deep ache in my feet from the day's physical demands and a profound mental fatigue. Beyond the glass, the late autumn gales rattled the window panes, contrasting sharply with the uncanny quietude that filled the interior rooms. He had exited the house moments before under the pretense of wanting a breath of fresh air, an action I easily dismissed given the sheer magnitude of the day's stress. Upon his re-entry, an aura of preoccupation surrounded him, an attitude distinct from mere anxiety or anticipation, characterized by a fragmented focus. His gaze repeatedly drifted toward the glass, searching the exterior gloom and straining to catch any sound from the night. When I inquired if an issue had arisen, he offered a brief, dismissive grin before averting his eyes, claiming that fatigue was the sole cause, a claim I desperately sought to accept as truth. Instead, the intuitive dread that had shadowed me for months surged back with unprecedented intensity. Shortly thereafter, he migrated into an adjacent space, leaving the doorway slightly unlatched behind him. Though I possessed no intent to eavesdrop or uncover hidden truths, the sound of his vocalizations drifted out, subdued, deliberate, and entirely altered in tone. Initially assuming he was uttering thoughts aloud to himself, it quickly became apparent that he was engaged in a dialogue with an unseen individual, prompting me to step forward instinctively, narrowing the distance between us. The subsequent phrases defied comprehension in those initial seconds, punctuated by his mention of an unfamiliar identity, followed by an uneasy chuckle, the distinct sound of someone masking intense apprehension. A feminine voice responded from the other end, causing me to completely paralyze. The presence of a telecommunication device within that area was not fundamentally uncharacteristic, as certain households utilize shared community lines or maintain hardware in adjacent outbuildings. However, the nature of the communication itself was entirely unprecedented, marked by the female speaker inquiring about the timeline for his departure. That specific concept immediately seized my focus, raising the frantic question of his destination. He modulated his speech to a lower register, obscuring the full context of his statements and leaving me to catch only fragmented clauses. Yet those fragments provided a terrifyingly clear picture. Words like an inability to remain, having endured a sufficient delay, and an imminent departure emerged from the murmur. Then, a detail surfaced that caused an immediate visceral sinking inside me. The individual on the line addressed him explicitly by a secular name, entirely ignoring his identity within the community. For a fleeting moment, I attempted to rationalize that exhaustion had distorted my hearing, or that a different term had been uttered, but he responded immediately to the pseudonym without a shred of reluctance, adopting it as his own. I remained motionless, grappling with information that possessed no logical place within my reality, and the moment the dialogue ceased, I retreated swiftly to the cooking area to avoid detection. My fingers trembled uncontrollably as I struggled to construct a benign justification for what had transpired, yet every rationalization I manufactured grew increasingly hollow. Approximately 20 minutes elapsed before he rejoined me in the kitchen, taking a seat across the space while an oppressive silence expanded between us. Ultimately, I broke the quietude with a straightforward inquiry, demanding to know the identity of the secret name I had heard. In an instant, all vitality drained from his features, an indelible image of a solitary question triggering an immediate physical betrayal that revealed, if not the entire scope of the situation, a sufficient portion of the truth. He maintained absolute silence for a prolonged interval, highlighted only by the rhythmic cadence of the wall clock and the muffled sound of livestock moving in the nighttime yard. When he finally spoke, his inquiry was not to challenge the accuracy of my ears, but rather to ascertain the exact volume of the conversation I had intercepted. A constricting sensation gripped my torso as I lowered myself into a chair, fixing my eyes intently upon the natural patterns of the tabletop, because meeting his gaze had become an insupportable prospect. I pressed him for an explanation of the circumstances, prompting a fragmented, hesitant confession that seemed to cause him physical distress with every syllable uttered. Long before our paths had crossed, he had engaged in employment in close proximity to the non-Amish populace, dedicating a far greater amount of time to that environment than anyone in the congregation ever suspected. During that period, he had established deep attachments within the secular world, effectively initiating a dual existence divided between his responsibilities inside the settlement and a hidden reality outside its borders. This alternate life involved a complete transformation: alternative attire, a separate social circle, uncharacteristic behaviors, and an entirely separate persona operating under a non-Amish name beyond the community. I maintained my composure and remained silent as the details unfolded, noting a sudden drop in the perceived temperature of the space, while my physical fatigue evaporated, superseded entirely by a growing terror. The revelation that followed dismantled my reality completely, as the female individual on the other end of the line was neither an acquaintance nor a professional associate, but rather someone with whom he had maintained a romantic entanglement for an extended duration. This connection had persisted throughout the entirety of our courtship, our formal betrothal, and the final days preceding our marriage ceremony. A profound sensation of emotional paralysis washed over me, displacing any immediate anger with an absolute vacancy, as the individual occupying the seat opposite me transformed into a complete enigma, a stranger merely masquerading in a familiar form. When I questioned his motivations for entering into holy matrimony with me, his explanation delivered a devastating blow that still echoes with profound pain. He confessed to harboring an illusion that marriage would act as a remedy for his internal fragmentation. He had convinced himself that by offering a total outward dedication to the Amish way of life, the secular dimension of his existence would naturally wither away, hoping the sacred ceremony would mend his fractured identity when, in reality, it merely accelerated the unraveling of his entire deception. My gaze drifted toward the bridal attire suspended in the room, a stark reminder that a mere few hours prior, the community had gathered to honor a destiny that I now recognized was constructed entirely upon a foundation of falsehoods. The physical constriction within my torso intensified to an agonizing degree, forcing me to rise and retreat to the glass pane, staring out into the unyielding night. Every single intuition, uncertainty, and internal tremor that I had deliberately suppressed across the preceding months coalesced and struck me simultaneously, bringing the sudden realization that those warnings had been an internal mechanism designed for my own preservation. His voice persisted in the background, a continuous stream of rationalizations, expressions of remorse, and defensive explanations that dissolved into a meaningless hum as a singular, repetitive mandate took hold of my consciousness. Departure was the only option. The definitive breaking point arrived when he conceded that the woman anticipated his arrival within a matter of days, and a portion of his desires still aligned with that departure. In that precise instant, the realization crystallized that the true lifespan of my union was measured in a mere handful of hours. Everything preceding this moment was an idealized commitment, whereas the present was an unvarnished truth. Moving deliberately into the sleeping quarters, I retrieved a modest satchel and commenced packing my personal belongings. This action served as the catalyst for his realization that my departure was imminent, eliciting a response that carried a psychological sting far sharper than the initial deception itself. He observed in silence as my garments were systematically transferred into the container, his initial demeanor reflecting utter bewilderment, as if he anticipated an outburst of weeping, vocal anger, or an extended confrontation. Contrariwise, my movements remained methodical as I prepared each piece of fabric individually, surrounded by an uncanny tranquility, while my digits remained perfectly immobile, despite the total internal emptiness consuming me. In a momentary lapse, a different name slipped from his lips before he quickly amended the error to address me properly, a fraction of a second that nevertheless registered with absolute clarity as another fracture in his facade, confirming that his consciousness was anchored elsewhere rather than the shared existence we had just initiated. Upon meeting his gaze, a visible terror manifested in his expression for the first time since the confrontation began. Not an anxiety rooted in the dissolution of our bond, but an apprehension concerning the impending fallout and the community's reaction once the reality was exposed. He pleaded for my presence to remain unaltered until the break of day, a request that indelibly marked my memory not due to any inherent malice, but because it laid bare his true priority, the preservation of outward appearances. With the celebration having concluded so recently, rumor would spread instantly through the settlement if news leaked that the new bride had fled during the initial evening. His objective was a stay of execution, an opportunity to formulate a narrative, devise excuses, and insulate his reputation from ruin. Placing the satchel upon the floor, I directed a solitary, uncomplicated inquiry toward him, demanding to know if any genuine affection had ever existed between us. The ensuing absence of sound felt immeasurable as his eyes drifted away, delivering a non-verbal confirmation that sent an icy sensation permeating through my frame, lacking any theatrical flair but carrying absolute finality, sealing a compartment within my spirit permanently. Securing my belongings once more, I navigated toward the threshold and stepped out into the open, immediately greeted by the biting impact of the nighttime atmosphere. The ambient conditions had plummeted beneath the freezing threshold, leaving a crystalline layer of frost clinging to the earth beneath an unclouded celestial canopy illuminated by a vast expanse of stars. The precision of my recollection remains flawless, a testament to how deeply distressing experiences etch specifics into the mind. The path leading back to my family's homestead spanned approximately 2 miles, a distance I would typically traverse using a horse and buggy under standard circumstances. On this specific night, however, I journeyed on foot in total solitude, the remnants of my bridal garments still clinging to my form as the stones of the path ground audibly beneath my steps, and my exhalations materialized as vapor in the crisp air. And persistent anticipation that the sound of pursuit would echo from behind kept me on edge, yet the silence remained unbroken. Reaching the midpoint of the journey, I paused against a wooden barrier as the sheer magnitude of my situation fully registered. The very same morning had been spent finalizing arrangements for a life partnership, yet the midnight hour found me retracing my steps as a newlywed stripped of her companion. I remained motionless in that spot for an extended duration, devoid of tears or vocalization, entirely consumed by the effort to contextualize the upheaval of my existence within an environment that suddenly felt completely alien. Upon my eventual arrival at my family's residence, the structure was entirely swathed in darkness, the hour having advanced well past midnight. I struck the wood of the door once, followed by a subsequent summons, until my father unbolted the entryway after a brief delay. The configuration of his features shifted instantaneously as his gaze scanned the satchel, the state of my attire, and finally my face, signaling an immediate comprehension that a crisis had occurred. My mother materialized in the shadows behind him, and showing a profound restraint, neither parent subjected me to immediate interrogation, choosing instead to guide me over the threshold. The interior cooking space offered a comforting warmth, centered around the illumination of a solitary lantern placed upon the table surface, where I remained seated in absolute silence for an extended interval. Eventually, my father gently broke the quietude, prompting me to recount the events, a request that led to a comprehensive disclosure of every single element, phrasing, and circumstance. I detailed the hidden persona, the intercepted telephonic exchange, the female associate stationed beyond our borders, and the systemic dishonesty that had spanned years. An absolute muteness enveloped the space as my mother cast her gaze downward, and my father remained fixed on the wooden grain before him, both allowing me to speak without a single disruption. As my testimony concluded, my father shifted his posture backward in a deliberate motion before uttering a completely unanticipated admission, confessing that a persistent dread of this exact outcome had haunted him. My gaze snapped upward as an intense panic surged within my chest, driving me to demand clarification regarding his statement. He paused in contemplation before disclosing a history that had previously been withheld from my knowledge, explaining that during an earlier period, unsubstantiated reports had drifted through the community regarding his character. These accounts lacked definitive substantiation or precise details, manifesting instead as vague narratives, inquiries, and quiet remarks regarding his unannounced departures and secular involvements. Because these apprehensions never breached the public sphere of the congregation and definitive verification remained elusive, the murmurs gradually dissipated as the community redirected its attention, leaving my father to harbor a silent aspiration that the hearsay was groundless, a hope that had now utterly evaporated.